From Askwith Lecture Hall on the campus of Harvard Graduate School of Education in Cambridge, Massachusetts, this is Talk of the Nation. I'm Neil Conan.
Children must be tested every year, not just in the 3rd grade or the 8th grade, but in the 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th, and 8th grade.
That was President George W. Bush at a speech before the Urban League in April 2001. As part of a plan to improve education and make schools accountable, the president pledged to make annual tests mandatory in grades 3 through 8. That pledge is now law. This past January, the president signed the No Child Left Behind Act. It's the latest measure in the drive to reform our public schools, which began in 1983 with the release of the landmark report, A Nation at Risk. Failing schools, the report warned, hurt American students and their ability to compete in the workforce. It also affected the nation's ability to compete globally. Many politicians and business leaders demanded standards and standardized tests to ensure that students, teachers, and schools were meeting their goals. Now, almost 2 decades later, all 50 states have adopted some form of standards and standardized tests, but different states apply different standards, and they use different tests. Are we all measuring the same thing? We're here at the Harvard Graduate School of Education in collaboration between NPR News and the PBS series Frontline. 1 week from tonight, Frontline will air a documentary called Testing Our Schools, which examines how the tests and standards are remaking public education in America. The question that we and the documentary ask today is, what are we measuring? Are we measuring individual student performance? Are we measuring individual school performance? Or are we measuring how one school is doing relative to another? Does this testing tell us what we need to know? How's testing working out in your school? Join the conversation. Our number here in Washington, we're here in Cambridge, is 800-989-8255. That's 800-989-TALK. Our email address is totn@npr.org. And let's introduce our guest this hour, John Merrow, a former teacher, host of the PBS education series The Merrow Report, correspondent for the Frontline documentary Testing Our Schools, and many years ago, host of NPR's Options on Education. John, welcome.
Thank you very much, Neil. Great pleasure to be here.
Also like to welcome Jeff Howard, founder and president of the Efficacy Institute, a nonprofit educational training and consulting company. Good to have you here.
Happy to be here.
And Dan Koretz, a professor of educational assessment at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Thanks for having us here.
Delighted to be with you.
Okay. Our questions. John, your documentary takes a look at the proliferation of testing in public schools. It concentrates on 3 states, Massachusetts, Virginia, and California. Why those 3?
Well, they in a way, Neil, they represent the good, the bad, and the ugly. Although some people in Massachusetts might not be pleased to hear me say that, Massachusetts actually does it very well. They said that they're willing to spend some money to create new tests. They fought very hard to decide about standards and tried to have them align, is what educators say, so that the standards, what's actually taught and what's tested, match. California is a mishmash, and that's the other side of it. In Virginia, it's fascinating for the battles. We got behind the scenes on the Frontline documentary next week to show how hard it is to set standards.
Well, getting back to the main question of this hour, are we measuring the same thing? I mean, the objective of the reform movement was to establish some sort of standards and then test to make sure we're meeting them.
Well, it's two quick points. Standards are a good thing. We absolutely have to have standards. You have them for a radio broadcast. You have them. We should have them, of course, in the education business. Standardized tests are a good thing. All that means is you take them under the same conditions, under standardized conditions. The flaw is in multiple choice tests, in my view, because there's so many things you cannot test with a multiple choice test. And if you're doing multiple choice tests, that ends up shaping the way things are taught. So you get the tail wagging the proverbial dog.
Jeff Howard, are we measuring the same thing with these tests?
No, different tests around the country are in fact measuring different things. The states haven't sort of got it all together. There hasn't been enough federal input into this to set national standards, including national standards of assessment. So we have a system where each of the 50 states is sort of doing their own thing and trying to get it right. Fortunately, they're also meeting and talking to one another, and I think over time we're going to get to a situation where the best states become the standard and the model for everyone else, and we're going to sort of even this thing out across the country. Then we'll be measuring about the same things.
So in a transitional phase, you think?
We're in the beginning of a new movement in education that I think is going to hold. I don't think we're going to back off of it, and over time I think we're going to get better.
What are the things we're measuring, Dan Koretz? Are we measuring students, teachers, schools?
Well, all tests do is describe. They don't explain. And when you get a test scores for students in a school, all you have is a description of what those students can do. You don't know anything about why they can do it or why they can't. And that, in my view, is one of the 3 or 4 central fallacies in the rationale of the current the law that just passed. The assumption is that once you have, say, an average test score for a school, you're measuring school quality. And in fact, you're not. You can't.
Is there any way to measure school quality?
Well, certainly there is, but you can't do it simply by measuring the performance of students on one test, in part because the one test is incomplete, and in part because there are a great many things that influence how well students do in school, many of which have nothing whatsoever to do with how the school is operated.
Jeff Howard, would you agree with that? If you get a reasonable test, is it a reasonable measurement?
It's a reasonable measurement of what kids know and what they're able to do. Now, there's a range of reasons why they know or don't know something, but to start with, we need to know what do kids know, what are they able to do, and good assessments will give you a picture of that. From there, you can begin working backward to figure out what has to be done. What do we have to change in order to get these kids, whatever their background, to a higher standard? So you can't avoid having an assessment. In this country, we went for decades without having kids be assessed. So teachers were able to do whatever they wanted to do. Some did a great job. I have been in many schools where teachers did nothing. And part of what I see happening because of this movement for assessments is that people are getting religion about the fact that they're going to have to do something with these kids or else it's going to be exposed.
John Merrow, give us some of the advantage of your research. What kinds of tests are we talking about?
Well, the question of how you measure, I mean, Dan's point is valid.
Mm-hmm.
The test score describes, you need diagnosis, you need to analyze, you need good tests, but you need multiple measures. One of the things the testing movement does is they talk about multiple opportunities. Neil, you failed it, but we'll give you 4 more chances. Actually, instead of multiple opportunities, what you need are multiple measures. Let's not just the test, but you do need the test. But let's also look at grades. Let's look at teacher assessment. And if you want to judge a school, you asked Neil about judging a school. There are lots of other measures to look at to figure out whether a school is any good. So look at who's teaching. Are the teachers qualified to teach the subjects they're teaching? And 30% of the teachers of advanced science courses haven't studied science. That's one measure of quality. Look at teacher attendance. Look at pupil attendance. Look at how, there are all kinds of other ways. It really is a fallacy to think we can find this one quick fix measure and that'll solve everything.
Jeff Howard, are we hinging too much on the results of these tests? I mean, a student will get a high school diploma perhaps or not. A school could be closed or not.
Well, one of our panelists said in the conversation we had earlier that if you don't have accountability for students on these tests, excuse me, you discover that the kids don't take it seriously. They make patterns on the paper as opposed to answering the questions in a valid way. I believe that there have to be consequences for students to motivate them to do the work they need to do to become proficient in reading and mathematics and science. So I cannot shrink from high stakes tests. I think we need high stakes assessments, not as a single measure, but there has to be something kids know they have to do if they're going to get a high school diploma. Otherwise, they don't get the high school diploma.
John Merrow?
Well, there's a gotcha mentality behind a lot of this testing, and that's a fundamental problem. If the people who are putting these things in place are really just trying to catch you as a bad school or you as a failing student, that's not going to work. I mean, the idea, the education system ought to be designed the way we build highways. You build highways with a margin of error on either side. The car could swerve a little and you don't have a crash.
I haven't been to Jersey lately, have you?
but seriously, if you say, well, what we want when you build that highway is you want to get to the destination. And so you that's the way we ought to conceive of an education system, that our goal is to get the kids there, and let's figure out what we need to do to get each kid there, whether it's you or Jeff, Dan, or me. It may require different kinds of training or interventions, not a test which is, gotcha, you fail.
But Dan Koretz, if a school is regularly failing, clearly it is failing its students.
Well, that's right. And then the next step is to go in and find out why. But to answer your previous question, there's no question that we are putting much too much weight on these tests. It's axiomatic in measurement that you should never make serious decisions about a child based on a single test. And there are numerous reasons for that. One of them is that the test is necessarily very incomplete. There are a lot of things about the student's capacity, performance, weaknesses that are not measured. But there are others as well. One is the error that John was referring to, the inevitable error. The third is that if you tell teachers and students that all that counts is a score on one test, you're giving them incentives to pay attention only to what's on that test, which is usually a very, very small sample of what you want students to learn. And we now have, I'd say a dozen years or more of good research showing that people, in fact, misbehave in schools when you do this.
Can I tell you a story?
Okay.
One of my kids, my middle daughter, has been teaching at a middle school in Harlem, teaches Italian. Last year, before the New York City and state test, the principal came in a month before the test began and said, okay, Ms. Mero, that's enough Italian. I want you to spend the class period practicing for the math test. But sir, I teach Italian. Don't do what I say. Well, the kids learned three things. Italian doesn't matter. She doesn't matter. Only the test matters. In New York City, they give the tests in May. They end around May 20th. There are still 5 weeks of school to go. Within a week after the last state and city test, half of the 8th graders stopped coming to school, even though school had 5 weeks to go, because the kids had gotten the message. The only thing that mattered was the test. I mean, a system like that dehumanizes kids, treats them as objects. I mean, you do need tests. You obviously have to have tests. You have to assess. But if they become the driving force, those are the future constituents of public schools. That's how you treat them.
John,
Jeff Howard, go ahead.
That's bad practice, and there's no question about that. The pendulum has swung too far in that direction. I dare say that principal is probably one of the people who fought against any assessment at all for years, and now that she's lost the battle, now let's stop Italian studies so that we can study for the math examination.
Do you think it's a minority of schools that do that?
Well, no, I think that's far too prevalent, but it's part of the growing pain process of people who don't really understand what these assessments are about. Look, these are proficiency examinations, the best of them anyway. They are measures of whether kids have the knowledge in the subject matter that's being tested and the ability to use that knowledge in new and novel situations. That's the definition of proficiency, knowledge plus application skills. We ought to know that kids have proficiency in core academic areas, whether it's just reading and math or whether you want to add 3 or 4 additional subjects. But let's find that out and not throw that out because we have some practitioners who are presently making bad mistakes in their application of this. They're going to learn over time how to do it or be replaced by better people.
In the meantime, the system lost my daughter, who said, I don't need this.
And I know
lose a lot of
teachers.
teachers. That's another consequence when you...
Dan, I see you try to get in here.
I think this is in some discussion is missing one of the critical points. When teachers are told that one test counts, they have in front of them usually a fairly small number of questions or tasks or test items. And what they're being told is that those few things are what matters, not the broader range. This is not a matter of growing pains. This is a matter of distorted incentives. And we know what teachers do if we put too much emphasis on those scores, what many teachers do. They say that's what matters. And one outcome is that desirable instruction that doesn't support the test gets lost. Another outcome is that scores become egregiously inflated.
You're listening to a special Talk of the Nation Frontline broadcast from the Harvard Graduate School of Education in Cambridge, Massachusetts. We're talking about standardized tests in our public schools. Are they really a good measure of what our kids are learning? What do you think? Give us a call, 800-989-TALK, that's 800-989-8255, or send us email. The address is totn@npr.org. We're going to take a short break. When we come back, we'll start taking your questions. I'm Neil Conan. This is Talk of the Nation from NPR News. Today we're at the Askwith Lecture Hall at the Harvard Graduate School of Education in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I'm Neil Conan. We're talking about the use of tests in our schools to measure students and school performance. Are they an accurate reflection of how our students and our schools are doing? Here's a student who had some frustrations with testing. This is from the Frontline documentary, Testing Our Schools. Well, we're having a little difficulty rolling in the tape, but what the student says is the test is 1 year ahead of the curriculum. When you're a freshman, you take the World Studies test before you even take the course. As a sophomore, you take the American History test before you even take that course. And as a junior, you take American Political System and Economics on the test before you take the course. So basically, you're taking a test on stuff you don't even know yet. That was David Wynn of Logan High School in Union City, California, who had just taken the California State Standardized Test, the Stanford 9. So what has been your experience with testing? You're invited to join the discussion. Our phone number, 800-989-TALK. Our email address is totn@npr.org. Let's reintroduce our guest, John Merrow, a former teacher, host of the PBS education series The Merrow Report, and correspondent for the Frontline documentary Testing Our Schools. Jeff Howard, founder and president of the Efficacy Institute, and Dan Koretz, professor of educational assessment at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Are there bad tests and good tests? Jeff Howard?
Yes, there are bad tests, and we have a lot of them around the country. The TAS, the Texas Assessment of whatever the last two letters stand for, is considered not a great test. But this is a very interesting point. Texas has done, I think, has made great progress in education, especially education for children of color, because of the TAS. Now, they have to make it better. But the TAS is not as good a test as the MCAS in Massachusetts, for example, is right now today. There's a great deal of unevenness in these tests as of right now.
Dan John Merrow.
Money talks on that. I mean, the Stanford 9 test costs about, as we make clear in the Frontline documentary, costs about $6 a kid to administer. That's cheap. A good test, like the International Baccalaureate test, costs about $60 a kid. It takes a lot of time to score, but it's a good test. It helps you diagnose what a kid knows, doesn't know. It's a much better test. So money is clearly an issue.
And how much did the MCAS test cost here in Massachusetts?
Well, the state spends about $20 million a year developing the new test. What they do in Massachusetts, it's a transparent system, which it ought to be. Education ought to be transparent, so I, as a parent, can know what's going on. They develop a new test every year. They release the test. It's on the web. You can go take it and see how you do. Those things cost money.
And Dan Koretz, are these tests, because of the wide diversity in the quality of the tests, that's clearly a problem. If the tests can be improved, at that point, would you think that they do measure something valuable?
Well, even some of the ones that aren't very good in their present use can be very good in other uses. The fundamental problem is not the quality of tests, even though there clearly are bad tests and good tests. The fundamental problem with the current policy is how tests are being used. And the irony of this is that if you put too much pressure on people to raise scores, you lose the ability to learn from those scores, because the scores ultimately become meaningless.
Let's get a question from our audience here at the Hall in Cambridge, Massachusetts. A gentleman to my left.
My name is Ken Hodkinson. I live in Barrington, New Hampshire. I'm the author of the Wordly Wise series of vocabulary builders, and my question is this. Testing results in winners and losers. Are we ready to accept that not all students are above average?
Can I answer that question? That's a really important question, and it underlines a basic misconception that's out there about these tests, and that is that all tests are the same. There are two basic categories of tests. Norm reference testing, which a lot of us in the audience grew up on, create winners and losers. You got the top decile, you got your bottom decile, you got your average and above average. They are designed to designate winners and losers. Criterion reference tests, which many of the state tests around the country are today, are designed to create winners, by which I'm saying you have a criterion for success, proficiency. All children who take the test could achieve that standard. Children are not being compared to one another, they're being compared to a criterion. So it's just a basic misconception to think that the new tests are designed to create winners and losers. They are most explicitly not designed to do that.
Dan Koretz?
I think what Jeff has said is actually one of the most fundamental misconceptions in the current debate about testing. Tests don't create winners and losers. There are winners and losers. Anywhere you look in the world, even in much more equitable societies, there is an enormous variation in how well students perform. It's not much different in Japan, which is very homogeneous than it is here. If you choose not to measure that variation, then you won't see it, but it's there, and it's not there because of the tests.
Let's get to our first caller, and that's on the line in Washington. Our next caller is Mike in Philadelphia.
Hello.
Hi, Mike, you're on the air.
Hello. I'm
Yes.
on the air.
Yes, you are.
Well, I want to give a plaudette to the last gentleman who just said something to Jeff about testing. He's right on. I teach math and physics in the Philadelphia area. We're going bankrupt here. The students are totally awash with practicing taking tests. They don't know algebra, they don't know geometry, and they don't have the time to do it. They have to study for the test, which comes up in May. So they have a whole month to shoot. That's number one. Number two is, why can I teach in a university math and physics, but I have to be, quote, certified by an educational institute to teach AP calculus in high school? Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much for the call, Mike.
Just a question back for the caller.
I think he's left, so.
Well, for the people who share his opinion, I wonder if the children of Philadelphia were doing better at algebra and geometry and social studies before the testing movement happened. Now, that's a rhetorical question. The fact is, we all know that they weren't. We've got to compare this new regime to what came before it. And that's a situation that you talk about variability. The variability was in teaching. The variability was in homework. The variability was with what parents did with their kids. Since there was no standard for anything, anything went. I was once in a classroom. Now you talk about a story. I walked into a classroom as a visitor from out of town. A high school teacher was sitting behind his desk reading a newspaper. The kids in the class were watching a video on a subject unrelated to the subject of the course. He did not stop reading the newspaper when we walked in. Why should he? He had no incentive to. We have created now a new system where there are some incentives for actually teaching the material, because we know that kids are going to be assessed with some imperfect assessment, but some assessment to find out whether they know anything.
Jeff,
10 years ago, we didn't have that.
John Merrill.
Jeff, I don't think anybody's arguing that we should go back to some good old days. I mean, I actually spent 6 years in Philadelphia on a documentary about David Hornbeck, the superintendent, who brought in the testing and tried to. But what they are using in Philadelphia is a Stanford 9, which is a norm reference test, which is not really connected to the curriculum. So you don't want to go back to what they were doing, but what the substitute is not necessarily a step forward. It's the right idea. You have to have standards, but if you use bad tests.
How do we feel about the federal tests, the president's new testing regime that's going to come on board soon?
Well, what that calls for is testing, as Neil said in his introduction, in all 50 states in grades 3 through 8 in math and reading, and everybody knows that, and I think people generally applaud that. But it also says that states can select their own test, and then it also says that states can decide what is proficient. So that I'll pick the test and I'll tell you whether I passed or not. There's just something a little fuzzy in there. So it's a step forward. Sure. But if anybody thinks Nirvana is here, they're sorely mistaken.
It's just better than what we had before.
Okay. Let's go get another question from the audience here in Cambridge, and the lady to my right.
My name is Elizabeth Marin. I'm from Cambridge, Massachusetts. My question is, even students who do well in school may not necessarily be successful in life. What is the point of spending time on testing when students are not always transferring academic success to life success?
I'm not sure who wants to handle that one. John Merrow, you're the generalist. I'll give it to you.
Means I don't know anything, but that's actually a fascinating issue, because we clearly have to have standards. We need standards, and the argument about setting them is profound. But she's correct. Some of the tests do not measure whether you can work with other people, whether you can grab in new information and assimilate it and present it to other folks. I mean, there are a lot of skills that you need in the workplace that are not taught in school and not measured on tests. A lot of things you do in your job, juggling us, those are not things you learned in school. And so she's right. I mean, doing well on a test is not necessarily going to mean you'll be successful.
Am I correct in saying that the test with which we are most familiar is the SAT test, which is not exactly what we're talking about, but the SAT, as far as I understand it, does not measure or predict success in college, the thing it's supposed to test for, beyond the first year?
It is a norm-referenced multiple-choice test that tests whether kids remember stuff. It is not a good examination. It is not as good as many of the state tests that are sweeping the country today.
And Dan?
I don't agree with any of that. It's not a test of content to begin with, so it's not testing memorization. There are a lot of arguments in the field right now about whether it's the right kind of test to use, but it does predict. The reason why you normally see predictions of first-year college performance is that's normally all the data colleges will provide. It doesn't predict strongly, but it does predict to some degree.
There are two SAT tests. There's SAT 1 and SAT 2. SAT 2 is a content test, and the University of California is moving to get rid of SAT 1 and use SAT 2, which is a much better test in my view.
Get another question from the floor, and this time we will go to my left.
Hi, my name is Morellen McLeish. I'm from Arlington, Massachusetts. I'm the mother of a sixth grader who's studying Wordly Wise, what that gentleman authored. And my question is, have there been any studies to show if standardized tests have, in the public schools, have impacted numbers of applications or enrollments in private schools?
That's an interesting question, and I'm not sure that there's an answer to it on this panel.
Not
John?
I've certainly heard the stories that parents in affluent communities are saying, we don't need this. This is mind numbing, and so we'll leave. And I think I told you the story of my daughter who left. I mean, so there is a danger. I don't know that there's any. I don't know any data.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I don't know of any studies.
Are tests like the tests that we talked about in the new education bill and like the tests we're talking about, do private schools run those tests?
They are exempt for the most part in my experience. They do not have to take in New York, for example, the private schools do not have to take the city and the state tests. And I suspect that's true in most places, which is one of the reasons you might see the exodus. If parents have the money and say, we'll get a richer, deeper education without all the drill.
Well, go ahead. I'm sorry,
One or two of
Jeff.
those private schools do, however, focus on the SAT and try to prepare children to get 600 or 700 or above. And some of the same parents who would pull their kids out of a public school system because they don't like a testing regime will enroll them on Saturdays at Kaplan to study for the SAT. So there's some hypocrisy in this whole thing about, we hate tests and it's a bad thing, and middle-class people just don't think that we ought to have our kids subjected to that. They don't mind the SAT.
And there's another fundamental element of accountability for private schools, which if the parents don't like the school, they can just take the kid out. So private schools have a number, at least they say there's an accountability system there that does not exist for the same level on public schools. Anyway, we were talking about testing and education. We're at the Harvard Graduate School of Education in Cambridge, Massachusetts today. Our guests are Dan Koretz, Jeff Howard, and John Merrill. And I'm Neil Conan, the host of NPR's Talk of the Nation. You are listening to Talk of the Nation from NPR News. And let's go back to the phones, and our next caller is Bill in Stockton, California.
And glad to meet you, Conan.
I'm glad to meet you.
The panel there.
Okay.
I'm on my cell phone. I'm sitting down at a local McDonald's. I hope I can be heard.
We can hear you fine.
All right. I'd like to comment that here in California, the information is more important that comes from what's in those tests than what comes out of a classroom. As someone so wisely pointed out a few minutes ago, in New York, the last 2 months of, or several weeks of the school year are based entirely on getting those test scores, and the kids say, to heck with it. Well, here in California, we have year-round testing, and we have year-round classrooms. And when the kids come into the classroom right after a break, invariably it seems like there's a brand new test that has to be administered within 1 or 2 days. Now, they've been off for a few weeks, but the most important thing is getting that test done. There's no prep time, and what prep time does occur has to occur in the weeks immediately preceding the break, and hoping the teacher stays, or hoping the information from the teacher stays. My wife was just at a mandated meeting where it was explained that the local school board just recently sent out a letter. And in that letter, it was commented that don't worry about the grades your child is getting. Those are all subjective. What's really important are these proficiency test scores. Any comments?
Well, John Merrow, in your good, bad, and ugly analogy earlier, I believe California showed up as Eli Wallach.
California came out ugly. Yes, Bill, I hope you get a chance to see our documentary on Frontline next Thursday night, because what you said is correct. It's the tests that matter. And in California, and Jeff earlier made the point that you need consequences all the way around. There were no consequences for the kids. There have to be consequences for everyone. Otherwise, the kids won't take it seriously. But take a look at that documentary. I think you'll find it illuminating.
I plan to look at it. I enjoy Frontline.
Okay. Dan Koretz, you wanted to get in on this?
If you go back 30 years or more, before the high-stakes testing movement really started, what you'll find is that the explicit purposes of some of the tests that were then published was not to supplant what teachers know or what kids bring home from school, but simply to supplement it, to provide an additional source of information. And I think that's what the caller is pointing to, that currently in many cases it's supplanted all of the other, in some cases much more important information about how well students are doing.
Bill, thanks very much for the call.
All right. Thank you very much, Conan.
And I can recommend the fruit and yogurt parfait.
Thank you again.
Email question, this one from Gavin Johnston, and this is a question: shouldn't we treat standardized tests as a compromise? Although they don't truly measure all facets of intelligence, they are better than not having a measurement. Dan Koretz?
I think that's exactly right. The question is the mix, and we've gone too far in one direction now.
And Jeff Howard, you were making this point earlier.
That was a wise man. We've got to have some common sense here and realize that we're coming from a situation where no one had any measures at all. You know, we used to hear teachers say, I taught the material, they just didn't learn it. And that was the end of that was it.
Can you imagine the swimming instructor saying that?
Absolutely.
One of those people at the bottom of the pool?
Now, not all teachers said that, but in the inner cities, too large a percentage of teachers had that attitude. These kids are incapable of learning, and if I just go through the curriculum, I've done my job. That's over now, because there's a sense that there's going to be accountability, first measurement and public display of whether people learned or not, and then some accountability back to teachers and to kids. So it's gotten everybody's attention. It's a wonderful new development. Is it perfect? No, but it sure beats the heck out of where we were before.
And we appreciate the fact that you remembered you were on the radio. We're talking about tests and testing and how you measure excellence by a multiple choice, an essay question, or all of the above. Are there good tests and bad tests? What would be a fair test? And you can continue this conversation online. Just go to npr.org, click on the discussion section, and scroll down to Talk of the Nation. We're going to take another short break. When we come back, we'll continue taking your calls, your emails, and questions from the audience here at the Askwith Lecture Hall at Harvard's Graduate School of Education. I'm Neil Conan. This is Talk of the Nation from NPR News. This is Talk of the Nation. I'm Neil Conan. Get used to that. Today, we're at the Harvard Graduate School of Education for a special broadcast of Talk of the Nation. We're in collaboration with the PBS series Frontline to talk about its new documentary, Testing Our Schools, which airs next Thursday night. Our guests are John Merrow, a former teacher, host of the PBS education series The Merrow Report, and correspondent for the Frontline documentary Testing Our Schools, the author, most recently, of Choosing Excellence. It's just out from... I can't even tell who's the publisher, John?
Scarecrow Press.
Ah, okay. Jeff Howard is also with us, founder and president of the Efficacy Institute, which is a nonprofit educational training and consulting company, and Dan Koretz, professor of educational assessment at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, also on the panel. After we have all the answers, what do we really know? Join the conversation. 800-989-TALK. Our email address is totn@npr.org. And let's go back to the phones for our next question, and it is Loretta in Bethel, Maine.
Hi.
Hi.
Thanks for having me.
Sure.
I have a sixth grader, and I have pulled him out of the public school system and put him into a private school because he has ADD. He is flunking his courses, even though I was helping him every night with his homework. And I kept insisting on a PET meeting, which was pupil evaluation team, so he would have testing to find out where he was at, whether he needed special ed services or not. Well, the testing showed that he was learning enough so that they would not give him special services, and he was just going to be put back into the classroom setting, which he was failing at. So I have had to take him out of the public school system and put him into a private setting. And he's now very happy, and he's doing really well. And my point is that the testing that they did to find out whether or not he needed special ed services was not geared towards what my problem was. Whether this child is smart enough to be learning this stuff or not was not the question. That my child needed one-on-one or other types of services. He was denied that because his testing was too high.
Is this the result, do you think, Loretta, of a one-size-fits-all kind of test?
Yes, definitely. In the state of Maine, unless you have to be tested along this criteria to get special ed services. There are children in his classroom that I'm amazed that made this criteria that are getting special ed help. They're taken out of the classroom setting. They go and get extra help on these places and these subjects that they're weak on, and then they get put back into the classroom setting at the end of the period. That's what I wanted for my son, and he could not get that because he had tested too high, and I had put my son on medication back in like the second or third grade, much to my going against my grain. I'm a very holistic type of mother, and I've given him the kind of medication that they said that he needs. I've done everything I'm supposed to be doing, and he's still failing. So the school system is failing him, but basically because they had judged that he could be doing well in the classroom setting and should be doing well because of this test.
Okay, Loretta, thanks very much for the call. Let's see if we get a response from the people on our panel.
Right.
I think we're talking about a different kind of assessment there.
Yes, this is Jeff Howard.
This is assessment to determine what the proper placement is for kids, and it's really something very different than the topic of this conversation, which is standardized assessment of what the broad base of children in a school system know and are able to do. But it raises an issue about ability. See, I think one of the big problems in the country, and it's reflected in the debate about assessment, is that we have serious questions in this country as to whether our kids are smart enough to achieve a high standard of excellence. And I think part of the resistance to testing has to do with the fear many people have that a lot of our kids will prove incapable of getting to a high standard. They'll be embarrassed. Their schools will be embarrassed. Everybody will feel bad by having this data.
And can I jump in on that? Because another thing we do, I agree with Jeff, that we in this country tend to think, well, you either have it or you don't.
That's right.
And we forget that hard work is what matters most.
The fact is, almost all of our kids, a huge majority, have more than enough intellectual capacity to achieve very high levels of proficiency in reading and math and any other subject that we want to teach them.
So not only do we need standards, we need higher standards. We need to ask more of our kids.
That's right. And we shouldn't be afraid of assessments. We should use assessments to diagnose where we are right now, how far we have to go, what are the particular issues we need to work on to get our kids to those high standards.
And isn't that precisely, Dan Koretz, what's called for in the new bill, accelerating standards?
Well, it's not entirely clear what the new bill calls for, because it tells states that they have to set standards and that they have to use a very formulaic and rigid way to determine whether schools are approaching those standards quickly enough, but it doesn't say where the standards should be. It flies in the face of what we know about how schools progress when they do progress, but we don't really know how extreme it will be until the states set the standards.
Let's get another question from the audience here in Cambridge. A woman on my right.
My name is Morgan Donaldson, and I'm from Somerville, Massachusetts. And my question is a fairly simple one. It is there empirical evidence that standardized testing leads to higher quality instruction?
Empirical evidence. So has somebody tested it, in other words?
Right.
Okay.
So to speak.
Dan Koretz?
I've spent about 12 years looking at that question. And the answer is that the studies to date show very mixed effects. They do show in some cases positive effects. In some states, for example, increased writing in the curriculum. They also show a whole host of very undesirable effects on instruction. And what goes with that is that they show in many cases increases in test scores. You mentioned Texas earlier. Texas is a case in point. Increases in test scores that are sometimes 4 and 5 times as large as the real improvements in student learning. In fact, in some cases, there are large increases in test scores that appear to be accompanied by no real increases whatever in student learning.
And the correct answer is yes, standardized assessments do in fact change instruction for the better. I cannot emphasize this too much. In many cases, we go from classrooms where there's almost no instruction going on to, for the first time, people trying to instruct children in the basic arts of mathematics and language.
Standardized is a good thing. That means fair conditions for everyone. Standards are a good thing. It's the kind of tests that can corrupt the teaching and learning.
But in general, accountability changes behavior. We had no accountability before, so people did whatever they wanted. Now, across the country, educators and parents are scrambling to learn how to educate these kids.
All right, Dan, you got another shot at it.
I think it's just a mistake, given the research that's been done, to talk about it as having good or bad effects. The evidence is very clear that the effects are mixed. And it's not the testing per se, it's holding people accountable for those scores that generates those effects.
What is the mixture based on? Geography,
Excuse me, I'm sorry?
What is the mixture based on? Is there a pattern to it?
Well, the research isn't really all that clear yet, but it seems to be based on a number of things. Part of it is the capacity of the school, the characteristics of the kids, how fast schools are required to increase scores, and so on.
But it's not based on geography or socioeconomic level, or?
Well, there are a number of us who think it's based on socioeconomic level, but the research isn't really very clear yet.
We shouldn't confuse ourselves with the facts in this case. Reality is common sense ought to guide us here. If the facts are manipulable, we can determine it's based on which studies we're looking at. But the common sense is that when you hold people accountable to achieve a level of proficiency with kids, it's going to change behavior when before there were no standards at all.
And John Merrill.
But the real danger is using the test as the be-all and end-all, because the tests have such flaws in them. I'll give you a quick example. Your blood pressure. If you took your blood pressure right now, it might be 120/80. Take it again a minute later with nobody yelling boo in between. It could be off by 10 points either way. That's so no doctor would take your blood pressure and say, oh my God, let's get Neil into surgery, or let's put him on medication. Doctors would give multiple measures. They'd find out about your habits, your diet, and so on and so forth before they did something. Educators should do the same thing.
So maybe not one huge test, but tests every year with the way.
To diagnostic tests, where the expert can say, well, this is what Dan doesn't understand. This is what John didn't get. Let's work on that. Tests ought to be the instrument to help kids do better, to get to proficiency that Jeff talked about.
And to help teachers become more proficient as educators.
You're listening to Talk of the Nation from NPR News. And let's go back to the telephones. Our next caller is Rachel in Greensboro, North Carolina.
Hi.
Hi, Rachel.
I'm a junior, actually, in high school in Greensboro, and I just wanted to talk about an experience I had with a history teacher a few months ago. I'm in a U.S. history class, and we received a role-playing assignment for people who changed American history in the 19th century. And there were 65 men on the list, and there were 6 or 7 women. And I told her, I said, I can't choose from this list. I know there were more women you could have put on here. Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, none of them were listed. And she said, well, those names aren't on the end-of-course test. And I went to my counselor. I was very upset about it. And basically I was told that teachers are supposed to teach for the end-of-the-year test, and if that's not part of their curriculum, then they shouldn't be required to put that on there. And first of all, I asked myself, why aren't these names on the test? And second of all, what message are we sending to high schoolers, to girls, or especially girls and boys for that matter, about what's important? And the fact that a teacher can't go outside of that curriculum and say, well, here are some people that are quite important also, even though North Carolina hasn't put them on this one test, and I was just very discouraged by it, and it's really disappointed me in the system. I don't know what can be done to change it, or even where you could start.
Well, let's see if we can get some advice, or at least some answers from the panel. Dan Koretz.
Rachel, your comment really hit the nail on the head, or at least one of the nails. What you're describing is precisely why scores go up more than achievement goes up, because people are given an incentive to focus on the specific content of the test and not on the broader domain of achievement, the broader subject area that the test ideally would represent perfectly well, or it might not perfectly well, but could represent well if people were not being put under so much pressure to raise scores.
Rachel, thanks very much for the call. We appreciate it. And John Merrill, I see you trying to get in here, and I know we're going to stipulate that your documentary goes into some depth about that history and who's on these sorts of things is a very controversial subject in almost every state. So I just wanted to see if we could get some more calls.
Yes, let's get some more calls in.
Let's get a question from the gentleman to my left.
Hello, my name is John Marcus. I live in northeastern Massachusetts, and I'm a principal in Stoughton, and I'm playing hooky from school, so I hope my superintendent's not listening. I'm concerned about some of the statements that I've heard, and I only had one written down when I handed in my question, but I've got 6 so far.
We are running out of time,
okay.
so let's start with one.
Okay. Failing schools, no accountability, so teachers did whatever they wanted. Ask more of our kids. They're not smart enough. I graduated from this wonderful institution 17 years ago and listened to people like Howard Gardner and Eleanor Duckworth tell amazing things about new ways to teach. And I go into my school and I ask my teachers to do those things all the time. And those don't get tested through pencil and paper tests. How do we measure creativity, ingenuity, entrepreneurship using a paper and pencil kind of a test? It scares me.
Jeff Howard, that sounds like it was to you.
You know, that's even, creativity and all those other wonderful things are even harder to measure than proficiency. So what I would propose is that we start by measuring proficiency in reading and mathematics, the basic stuff around the country, and use that as a platform to get more kids to the point where they can be educated at a level where they can achieve creativity. But right now, we've got too many kids who aren't there yet. Let's not stop doing the great things that we're doing in your school in Stoughton. Let's just now spread the good things across the country using standards and assessments as a means to do that.
And I wanted to ask one final question before we left, and that is, are we on the way to national standards and national tests? Dan Koretz, do you think that's the way we're going?
I think we probably are.
Yeah. Jeff Howard?
Yeah, I think we are, and we should.
Mm-hmm. And John Merrill?
Well, we already have them in some way because of the predominance of the textbook industry. So it'd be much more sensible to do it openly, have a dialogue, argue long and hard about what we want to teach, what we want our kids to know, but have a real argument about it. That's the debate that is missing.
Well, thank you all. I'm afraid that's all the time we have this hour. I'd like to thank everybody who joined us in the audience at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and especially our guests, John Merrow, former teacher, host of the PBS education series The Merrow Report, correspondent for the Frontline documentary Testing Our Schools. It'll be broadcast Thursday night, 1 week from tonight, on PBS. Jeff Howard, founder and president of the Efficacy Institute, and Dan Koretz, professor of educational assessment at the Harvard Graduate School of Education here in Cambridge. Our show today was produced by John Agolnik and Setsuko Sato, directed by Devin Robbins and Steve Lichtai. Mark Greenhouse is our technical director. We had engineering support from Kevin Waite. We also had engineering support in Washington from Marty Cursius, Cal Southworth, and Drew Reynolds. Other technical support was provided by Lorraine Carter. Leith Bishop is our executive producer. Special thanks to Christine Sani and Dottie Engler at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, Sharon Tiller of PBS's Frontline, and our own Kathy Miller. Remember to tune in to PBS next Thursday night for the Frontline documentary, Testing Our Schools. In Cambridge, Massachusetts, I'm Neil Conan, NPR News.